Alright, so let's talk about how to set up our graphing window in our 84 calculators. Let's go ahead and go to our y equals and enter in the two equations that you see into y1 and y2. So when you go ahead and press graph, the image that should pop up is the one that you see on the screen here. We see both of our functions graphed in our window, but we don't really have a good picture of how they look in the standard view window. And that's because if you press your window button, your window is currently in standard form, to where we have a x minimum of -10, our maximum is 10, our y min is -10, and our y max is 10. So we have a square image of our two functions on our graph. Our scales, that's what the SCL stands for, is 1 for each of our axes. And so that's not really going to give us the clear picture of how our functions are graphed on our coordinate grid. So let's go ahead and change our window values. Let's go ahead and type in an x minimum of 0 and a maximum of 30. Let's scale that at 5 just so that we can see nice clear marks on our graph. We'll minimum for our y value at 0 and we'll max out at 500. And then we'll go ahead and scale at 20 because between 0 and 500 the pixels on the calculator aren't really going to give us clear marks. It would look like just a really fat line. So by giving that 20 we actually will see some space between our marks. So let's see what happens now when we press graph. And so here's our graph. We can see it's so much prettier when we changed our window settings. Now if you remember, we set our change in y at 20 with a max of 500, and then we changed our delta x, or our change in x, to 5, and this maxed out at 30, which is why we have such large spaces on the x axis. We probably could have done a delta x of 2 and also had a really nice readable graph. Now that we've changed our window, we can see clearly the differences in our y-intercepts, and we can also see clearly the differences in our slopes for these two functions. So changing our window made reading this graph more meaningful, and we can have more discussions on how we can compare these two functions on the coordinate grid. One of the other features that I want you to be aware of is called trace. Now if you press your trace button, you're going to notice that this cursor pops up, and if you use your cursors on your calculator, you can go left and right and scroll along one of your functions. If you notice right now we're looking at our function y1, if you cursored up and just pressed up, it would take you up here to y2. And so, but if I'm tracing along my y1 function, you're going to notice that it gets not so pretty very quickly. And so as I'm tracing, we see that immediately I kind of got off whole numbers, and now my x is 15.9574 and my y value is not pretty either. So there are two ways that we can trace our functions in pretty windows, or friendly windows as we sometimes like to call them. And let's look at the first one. So your first friendly window that we're going to look at is under your zoom function, and you're going to press zoom, and it's number 4, and it's the decimal option. So when you press zoom 4, your screen's going to look something like this. Notice I'm still tracing along function y1. My screen is not a pretty window. I've kind of lost that beautiful window that we set up where I was able to see my y-intercepts and my slopes really pretty. You can see down here that my x and my y are set in decimals. And that's because if you have your, this window is going to change in decimal intervals, which is going to make your x and y values nice and pretty. And so that's your zoom decimal. And here's a look at your window settings when you're in zoom decimal. even though we can't see our X-Men in this screen capture, we can see that everything is set to our decimal values so that we get this nice pretty screen capture and our trace will move along. Also, you see down here our delta X, our change in X, is changing by 1/10, and so that's giving us those nice pretty values. Finally, the other zoom option that will make things nice and pretty for you is zoom integer, and that is zoom number 8. So zoom 8 integer, and so if you were to press zoom 8, this would be the screen that you would get on your graph. Again, I can sort of see my two functions here. I know that I'm tracing along y1, but if I'm in zoom 8 and I choose to trace, my x values are going to change by integers. And so that's going to be nice and pretty and give me those values that I want to get, the nice and pretty outputs that I want from my y values. So we've talked about how to set our window to be able to view functions that we've graphed in our y equals. I hope that you learned something. We also talked about two friendly windows that we could use to trace along our functions after we've graphed them. So thanks for listening.